Well, welcome back again. We are just kind of moving right on from what we just did, and it's good to see that you're interested. We're getting lots of comments down below. Thanks for those comments. We will be answering the best ones. Those who are really serious, those who are not trolling us, those who are actually asking questions. And the good questions, I'm going to get Mel back probably next week, and we'll go ahead and make sure that we get these answered, that we get them so you can follow through. Because one of the great things about what Mel and I are doing is that by putting this up on YouTube, we get peer reviewed almost immediately. And in fact, it's within minutes we get peer reviewed. Because of that, the peer review, that's the critique of what we're saying. That's what we mean by peers, like you are our peers. That is actually helping us and certainly helping Mel to then know where he needs to funnel his energies, where he needs to also unpack material that he has yet to look at. And also the realization that because this is so new, and it is so new, I don't know of anybody besides Mel who's doing this, who has found this material, or who's actually bringing it out to the public. There are areas that he's missed, and that's why we need your help. And that's why it's so good that you're asking these kind of questions, so that it fine-tunes us, it fine-tunes Mel, and makes sure that he's on the right track. And also the enormous amount of support we're getting from you all. Thank you so much. You really have done a real blessing to us, because you are showing that Mel is on the right track, that he is finding the right material, and that he's also coming to the right conclusions. Mel, there you are. Thanks for coming aboard again.
Great to be back. Yeah, it's a good reaction to the last video. It's good to see all the comments.
The comments are good and the questions are great. We're not going to answer them in this video because we still want to continue off. There's an awful lot more that Mel has to say about this issue of where the Quran comes from, and the fact that it's from much further north, up in Mesopotamia in the Euphrates Valley. So, and the fact that he's now gone through the language basis for it. When you look at the words, when you look at the Aramaic, when you look and see these references, not only in the Quran, but also from the traditions, Al-Bukhari, Volume 6, 509 and 510, showing that that argument that's going on there is not necessarily an argument about the Qurayshi versus everything else. It's actually about Babylonian Aramaic and Mandaic Aramaic. It's actually a very real argument that's happening in a very real place in a very real time, which all makes sense. Now we're going to go and look at the audience themselves. And this is the second half of the two-part series that we're doing on looking at whether or not it is Iraq that Islam began at, whether or not this man Muhammad actually lived in Iraq and not down in what we do today know as the Hijaz, known as Mecca, Medina. And who are these Qurayshi people? Who are they? Okay, Mel, I'm going to give it back over to you. You're going to bring up your PowerPoint. And as he's doing that, just to let you know, he's even actually increasing and actually changing it as he's been going back and looking at the questions. So this is very timely. Over to you, Mel. I can see you've got a map up there. Let's start with this map.
Yeah, so I suppose one thing I would like to do is to just go back just momentarily to the second video where I looked at the historical Muhammad, which was Iyas ibn Qabisa, and I used the evidence from Sebius that tells us where he was when he met a group of Jewish people, and he points out that he was in a place called Tashkistan, which is between the Tigris and the Euphrates. And Sebius actually tells us that the Jews had left Edessa, which is way up in north, and they were heading home, which presumably would be Babylon, where the Jewish exilarch was. And between those 2 points, we have Mesopotamia. So this is very interesting because obviously this fits like a glove with all the other evidence that we're going to look at today. And I'm going to start by looking at the Aramaic that's in this region, and then move on again to the audience. So as we mentioned the last day, there was 3 different dialects of interest. There was Syro-Aramaic, which is in Syria, Babylonian Aramaic in Mesopotamia or Iraq, and then off to the east we have Mandaic Aramaic. These are distinct dialects. They have similarities between them, but there's also significant differences. And if you spoke one dialect, you could very easily be confused with some of the words in the other dialect. There is also another dialect, which I haven't referred to yet, which is in the Palestinian area, which was Palestinian Aramaic, so that was more a Jewish form of Aramaic. So that's another one. It's not as important for our purposes, which is why I left it out. So going on from there then, the audience originally presumably could understand Aramaic and were familiar with Syriac literature, both Christian and heretical, because they got the allusions. The last day I mentioned about the fact that there's various Syriac stories referred to in the Quran, but they're not told, they're just alluded to. Another part of the audience was also familiar with a subject that was quite obscure, a mixture of Talmudic sources and various Jewish folklore. Again, they got the allusions. Now, just two things before I go any further. The audience that are reading the Quran or listening to the Quran are actually quite a sophisticated audience, even though there's lots of mistakes that we can point out in the Quran. This is kind of highbrow stuff to get all of these allusions. So we're talking about an intellectual audience who are familiar with Syriac literature. They don't need to be retold, it just pointed to Talmudic stories and so on, and it's all weaved together nicely. That's quite interesting. So bear that in mind. And the third part of the audience then were au fait with mandaic incantations and rituals, as I mentioned last day, as evidenced by the various calling on objects of nature, for example, on the mount, by the pen, and various other ones that we could point to. Yet the authors seem to be distinct from these groups. It's like as if the authors of the Quran are in the middle of a group having a discussion with these three members of the audience, not exactly identifying with any one of them, but having similarities with some, agreeing with some aspects, disagreeing with other aspects. And it's like as if they're writing the minutes down of the debate afterwards. Now, it's interesting that the Quran itself identifies its audience as Jews, Christians, and Sabians. Now, you can have a look there. I won't go through them, and I'm sure you're all familiar with those three groups. The Quran indicates that its audience are Jews, Christians, and Sabians, and you can take a look there at three different surah passages, Surah 2:62, Surah 5:69, and Surah 22:17. Now, let's start with the first group and think about, okay, we're looking for a Jewish audience who are quite a knowledgeable group, who get the allusions, get the references. So let's look for the Jewish intelligentsia in Iraq. Where are they? So here's a map of Mesopotamia or Iraq. And as you can see, here are where the yeshivas are. The yeshivas being the Jewish academies. So you have Nisibis at the top there. You have Pumbedita. You have Nahardia, Mehoza, and Surah. So what is a yeshiva? It's a Jewish educational institution that focuses on the study of traditional religious texts, primarily the Talmud and the Torah, and halakha, Jewish law. The studying is usually done through daily siurim, or lectures or classes, as well as in study pairs called shavrutas, which is Aramaic for friendship or companionship. So that's interesting that they had this idea of like a master-disciple process in the learning. Interestingly, we see the influence here on Islam that also places great weight on the companions of the Prophet, in Arabic, as-sahaba. So that's quite an interesting detail as we move on. So let's look at the different places that are in Iraq, which were the Jewish centers of learning. Pumbedita is in a location which is now Fallujah, and then there was another place called Surah. Pumbedita had a yeshiva. It was founded by Judah bar Ezekiel in the year 2020 to 299. The Surah Academy was founded in 225 by Abba Arika. They were both highly influential for about 800 years, so well into the Islamic time frame. At the time, so in other words, in the 7th century, the academies of Pumbedita and Surah became the most influential and dominant yeshivas for the Jews, and all Torah decrees and other religious rulings were issued from these yeshivas to all the Jewish diaspora, in other words, the Jews living outside of Israel. Pumbedita was key during the period in which the sources for the Quran were being gathered. After, with the sealing of the Talmud by Ravina II Surah, the era of Savoraim began 499 to 589, in which for most of that period, proper studying on regular basis no longer took place in Surah, only in Pumbedita. Now, Surah didn't cease to be a center of learning, but it became very much second place to Pumbedita, which remained the key place of learning at that time. So that's going to be a key clue to where the audience is. Is it merely a coincidence that the chapters of the Quran, which were considered separate books at one time, are called surahs? That's an interesting coincidence. Perhaps there is a link there. I would throw that out as a suggestion. Also can mention Nehardea, one of the earliest centers of Babylonian Judaism. It was the seat of the Exilarch. It traced its origin back to King Jehoiakim. Nehardea was destroyed in 259 AD, and its place as seat of the Second Academy was taken by Pumbedita. Towards the end of the 4th and at the beginning of the 5th century, Nehardea again became a center of Babylonian Judaism though this was overshadowed by that of Surah. So essentially, Pumbedita was first, then Surah, and then Nehardea. These were three very important places of learning for Jews. So as we can see, Pumbedita was the most important center for Jewish learning in the 7th century. So bear that in mind. We see that there on the map. Now, we see Pumbedita and we see Surah, and we see Al-Hira, which is the Nestorian Christian center. It's actually the capital, in a sense, for the Nestorians. And then way off in the east, there you have the Mandaean area, which some people believe to be identical to the Sabians, and there is scholarly dispute about that. But certainly, if they were the same group, it certainly makes sense. Now, just looking at the map, and this occurred to me when I was trying to think about the audience for the Quran. I looked at the surrounding audience. The obvious thing I thought of was, if you were to go to the center of all of that, say, for example, where you have Nehardea or Mehoza, that would be a logical place for the dialogue to take place in the Quran. And so that was my intuition. And so from there, I thought, okay, Mehoza is interesting. That's quite an interesting place. There's 2 cities there. Let's investigate that and see what we come up with to see, does that corroborate my intuition, which might be that that's where the Quran came from, as we can see there, okay? So my intuition was the audience surrounds Mehoza. Okay, so let's look at some evidence from Surah 112, considering now that the Quran was written with a Jewish audience, a Christian audience, and a Sabian audience. In the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful, say, He is Allah, the One, who is Allah, the Eternal, who was never born, nor ever gave birth, the one beyond compare. Now, what's interesting is the word that's used here for one is not an Arabic word. They have borrowed a word which is actually Hebrew. It's a Hebrew word, ahad, or achad in Hebrew. This surah demonstrates a willingness to use Pumbedita style learning to use as a stick against Christian Hira. It is entering the debate and saying on this issue, we side with the Jews over the Christians. It is also a polemic against the wording of the Nicene Creed. So as you can see there, if we were to compare the Nicene Creed with line 3, He is Allah, the Eternal, you'll see that in the Nicene Creed it begins with God the Father, God Almighty. I can't remember the exact words, but it refers to that. And then it moves on to talk about Jesus, and it talks about Jesus being begotten, not made. So here we can see in the Quran that it's using information from the Jews and using it to attack the Christians. And that's interesting. So this would suggest that the authors are interacting with the Jews and the Christians here. And this would make perfect sense if they are interacting with academics from the Jewish side. Okay. No.
Fascinating, because this is what we have seen with the Dome of the Rock, which we talked about earlier in 690 to 691, where you have almost all the reference. Again, 112 is also on those inner ambulatories, again, attacking Byzantine Christianity in this case, because you're there in Jerusalem, which is the seat not of power, political, but certainly of religious power for both Jews and Christians, with the Church of the Sepulchre, and also where the Dome of the Rock sits is where David's temple used to be. So it's fascinating that you see these. I mean, you're right. These are, if you look at if you unpack it from internally, you will see that these are discussions that are happening in a certain place, but then you have to place to where that place is. And in this case, Pampadita looks like you've got it. Well done.
Okay, so let's look at the alternatives. We have Mecca as a possibility. Did it happen in Mecca? Well, as we've discussed earlier, Mecca likely didn't exist even as a hamlet at that time. It certainly wouldn't have had a learned population in its vicinity in which weighty theology was discussed. So even if I grant to our Muslim audience that Mecca would have existed in some form or other in the 7th century, it is preposterous to suggest that there was Jewish academies in that vicinity. There simply wasn't. There is no evidence for that, but there is certainly clear evidence that not only that there were Jewish academies near Mahoza, but actually it was the academy. It's the most important one in Judaism.
Listen,
now, if
I
we
can
look
see
at
I can see the comeback on this, and I know that Muslims will try to shut you
okay,
down on this, and they'll say,
yeah,
"Listen, Mecca is where Abraham went to in chapter 21. If you look at chapter 7 of the Quran, verse 24, it is Mecca where Adam and Eve are then thrown down to out of the Garden of Eden." They'll come back to you with these, and for those Muslims who do that, look and see whether Mecca is in any of those verses. When you look at chapter 21 with verse 51 to 71 about Abraham, and it is not Mecca. Mecca is not there at all. It is the Kaaba. Well, Kaabas are in every major city. That's been proven now by Hitti and other scholars. And as far as chapter 7, verse 24, there is no reference to Mecca at all. It just says down to earth. Where do you get Mecca? You have to go to the 9th and 10th tradition to say that they were thrown down to Mecca. So again, throw that out, because we've already thrown out their traditions. The only reference, as we said earlier, the only reference we can find for Mecca anywhere, the earliest reference is not till the Continuata Byzantia, which is written in 741. That is the 8th century. Again, much, much too late, not the 7th century. So I would suggest that no Muslim can come back up to us and say, this is Mecca, that this is referring to. This is where the audience is. The audience is not Mecca. Throw Mecca out of this equation. We're in the 7th
yeah.
century, Muslims. Again, we're not in the 9th and 10th century. We're in the 7th century. We're not even in the 8th century. We're in the 7th century. In the 7th century, there is no Mecca. It doesn't even appear on any maps till 900 AD, which is the 10th century. So just to shut that down, because I know that will come up.
Okay, so we're going to put, if you like, a line through Mecca. I rule that out as a possibility. Petra, you know, it has certain things to go for it, but it was in decline. It had been a capital of the Nabatean kingdom 500 years before. In the 7th century, it seems it had no seats of learning and no significantly sized population of Jews and Christians that engaged in the type of dialogue we would expect to find in a more cosmopolitan location. In fact, the 2 Christian churches that I'm aware of in Petra are sort of out of the main center. They don't seem to be playing a significant role. It seems the pagans in Petra were the ones that were more significant at the time. Also, all Jewish theological questions typically were sent to Iraq for discussion and response. So, you know,
may I just interject something? I know you're going to talk about this in our question and answer period, and then what do you do with Petra versus what do you do with Iraq or Mahoza? I would suggest that we're looking at two, you are right, there is a diminution. Remember, Petra would be the historic place for the historic tombs and temples. It would be the historic sanctuary for the Nabateans leading up until the 7th century. But remember, once you start getting a political capital in Damascus, as we do know, this is where Muawiyah had his capital. This is the first time we see Arabs having a capital in a place like Damascus. Already, politically speaking, if that is the capital, then you got to ask what happens to Petra. Petra never was a political capital, but it loses its significance, as we're going to see as we go on. This whole civil war that was happening between the Arabs, and when Abd al-Malik then comes and introduces and puts the Dome of the Rock there in Jerusalem. Petra, no, though it's still significant for Abd al-Malik, in that he has his both the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque that were then created in 705 are facing Petra. That is true. But can you see what's happening to Petra? Petra is becoming less and less significant because you have these two great powers, and we haven't got into this, and this is not the time to necessarily bring it up, the Umayyads and the Abbasids, who are now vying for power. And that's going to come into your discussion, because the Abbasids where are they located? Interestingly, the very same place we're talking about in these three lectures.
Yes,
that's
absolutely.
in Iraq. That is that. So people pull back a little bit and start to look at the political powers that were vying for ascendancy, vying for people's control. Meanwhile, while that's all happening, it stands to reason that politically speaking, Petra is still important. But theologically speaking, and this is what Mel's talking about, theologically speaking, look and see where the learning centers were. And it looks like the learning centers were in Pembetita, or how do you pronounce it, in Surah, Pampedita, and Nehardia. And of course, all of that surrounding Mahoza, and of course you have the Al-Hira for the Nestorian Christians. All of this, that's where all of these discussions are happening. That's where the debates were happening.
Absolutely.
If the debates were happening there and the discussions were happening there, that would make sense in why the Quran is created there. And that would make sense what you said in the last episode of why this argument about this is a book written in Arabic. In Arabic, are you hearing me? Who are they talking to? They're talking to someone who are having the discussion with. You can only make an argument with another person. An argument takes two. So who is the audience that they're having this argument with? Take a look and see where the centers of learning were. Take a look and see where the centers of theological learning were. And it looks like they're all right here in the Mesopotamian area, which makes sense again, because that is where historically everything takes place for all the great civilizations happen in that area. No wonder then that's where the Jewish have their greatest centers of learning. So do the Nestorian Christians have their greatest centers of learning. Possibly even the Mandeans or the Sabaeans also have their center of learning in that area. But much too far north and much too far east. Back to you again.
Okay, so let's look at that Mahoza again. Now, Mahoza was the name in Aramaic for the cities of Seleucia on the west bank of the Tigris, and Ctesiphon on the east bank of the river Tigris, okay? In Arabic, the name is Al-Medain, the cities. The singular for that is Medina, which is city. So we see the word Medina. Now, obviously, that's interesting, the word Medina. It's not massively significant. It's just the Arabic word for city. But it gets better than that, as in the Sasanian times, Ctesiphon was called Medina al-Atika, the old city, the emphasis on the old city. This is not any old city. It's rightly referred to as the old city, as it was the capital of both the Parthian and Sasanian empires. This is a hugely significant city. Much, much more significant, at least from the Persian point of view, than Petra was. Obviously, Petra is very important from the Arabic point of view, or the Arabian point of view, but there is no city like this old city, as it's called, Medina al-Atika. This is the city for the Persians, so that is very significant. Okay, now, we mentioned in the very second video, I was going to say the first video, but the second video of our series, I spoke about my idea that Muhammad was this guy mentioned by Sabius, and who I identified with Iyas ibn Qabisa. Sabius says the following, just to remind ourselves of where he was located, just to see how it works out. So the Jews departed, taking the road through the desert to Tashkistan, Arabia, to the sons of Ishmael. The Jews called the Arabs to their aid and familiarized them with the relationship that they had through the books of the Old Testament. In that period, a certain one of them, a man of the sons of Ishmael named Muhammad, or actually I should say it correctly, Mahmed, became prominent. Mahmed taught them to recognize the God of Abraham. He ordered them all to assemble together and to unite in faith. Now, have a look. On the map is Edessa, which is up here. I don't know if you can see my cursor. Way down here is the seat of the Jews. Okay, way down here. It's probably actually just north of Babylon, actually. Okay, so the Jews have been asked by the Byzantines, well, it's probably more ordered to leave Edessa. There had been a siege beforehand, and the agreement was that they open the gates and they head home, which is down here. Okay, so it tells us that on their way they meet Muhammad and they have a discussion with him. Now it's interesting that here is where we find Old Medina. So far, all of the things that I'm saying so far all fit together like a glove. It all makes perfect sense. We don't get this corroboration if we place it in Petra, and we certainly don't get this corroboration if we put it in Mecca. Mecca requires incredible backflips to make it fit. Here, it's straightforward. There are no holes in the narrative. It all makes sense. You bring it down to the Hijaz, then you have to say Sebius got it wrong. Right in the 660s, he got it wrong. That, to me, that doesn't make sense. Yes, he may have got some details wrong, but he uses this word Tashkistan, which appears to be a Persian name for Mesopotamia. So he's very specific. Did he get it wrong? It makes perfect sense if his starting point is Edessa, and he's saying that the Jews went home, then it stands to reason that he's correct in terms of the location. Okay, so that's, oops, I'll just show you. That's where Sebius is locating Muhammad, okay, in that 7th century source, where you find a place called Old Medina, or the Old City. Now, another detail is the Battle of Dikar, which occurs in the Islamic traditions, is actually southeast of Old Medina, as you can see there. So Old Medina is, say, up here, just east of Najaf, and Dikar is down here. And as the bird flies, it's 135 miles, a little bit longer if you take a windy road, but there you have it. It's, you know, it makes sense. However, if you take the old tradition, you have a lot of explaining why they're making these really long trips to various places. It makes perfect sense when you set it in Iraq. Okay. Now, a question that is often asked, what about the Islamic calendar? Surely that contradicts what I'm saying. According to the Islamic tradition, the story behind the Islamic calendar is that Muhammad was exiled from Mecca and he went to Medina. So surely then I'm wrong. I've got something wrong here. That's what the Islamic tradition says. And is the Islamic tradition ever wrong? Doesn't that presuppose Muhammad was exiled out of Mecca and went to Medina? Because the calendar says so many years since this particular year, or whatever. It is possible that it relates to Muhammad being deposed from Hira, because the historical person that I mentioned was deposed from Hira. So there's him getting kicked out of Hira and moving to this Medina, which is inside the Persian border. And as someone in the comment section pointed out, Muhammad was a Persian proxy. In other words, he was chosen to work for the Persians and he was made a king in that area. So that kind of makes sense for him to go back to the Persian side after being deposed. So again, that makes sense. Or maybe this whole idea of being exiled from Mecca to Medina is just a foundation myth that somehow was an accretion that occurred over time as they started to turn it into a legend and romanticize the whole thing. Because very often people want to add details to places to make them more significant. The early inscriptions don't include AH with the year, but write in the year of the Arabs. They most likely this marks the year that the Arabs of the Ghasnids and the Lakhmids united to push off the yoke of the Persians, or more specifically the Sasanian house and the Byzantines. Again, Iraq is central to this. the Hijaz is outside the sphere of the action. Now, I spoke to, or well, actually, I had communication by email with a professor of Utah University, Dr. Peter von Sivers, because it is his thesis that the reason for the idea of in the year of the Arabs was this unity between the Ghasnids and the Lakhmids. I asked him for his source, and he had a source from the 7th century, and I can't remember the exact. Sorry, I can't remember the exact name of the source. I'll have to add that to the comment section later. But the key idea was that he saw in the source that there were a Western group and an Eastern group, and they united at this time. And so he identifies this as the beginning for the Arabs. Okay, so it wasn't about a mythical exile, but it was actually a unification amongst the Arabs, and there was a leader, which we call Muhammad.
This is, when I had my discussion with Robert Spencer, he brought this up as well when I asked, why is the year 622 so important? And he says, this is the time when the Arabs really rose up against their oppressors. And that is why it's important historically, why 622 then is now then chosen later on as the year of the Hijrah, which is the Exodus. It looks like, no, the reason 622 is chosen is because, and you've mentioned this before, this is when the Arabs started to get their identity in the fact that they were now rising up against those who had so far been in power over them. And this is what you always do whenever you're being oppressed or whenever you are you've been colonized and you rise up against that colony, then that becomes your independence day. That's why we here in the United States, we have our independence on July 4th, okay, against the tyranny of British. Sorry if you're being British, that's that I shouldn't use that.
I'm Irish, so that doesn't matter.
But that's why I love tea so much. And that's but the same thing you can say, and anytime you have a specific date where then your identity comes to the fore, then everything, all the dates start with that date, and that's why AH then has been reinterpreted as in the later traditions as the time Muhammad moved up to Medina. No, it looks like this is when the Arabs came into their own.
Yeah, this is a later invention and was projected back. I call this a retro version. It's taking an idea from a future time and pretending essentially that this happened in the 7th century.
Yeah, we call that redaction. That's called
redaction.
And what you're doing here is redaction criticism, and that's one of the things that you have to do when you look and see in almost everything we have been talking about. When one of the biggest problems we have with much of the later 9th and 10th century traditions is they do this redaction all the time, and they do it so that Muhammad comes to the fore, so that's Muhammad's life that is that takes that significance, when in reality this didn't really have to do with one person named Muhammad. It had to do with a whole people of whom Muhammad was part of, as we're going to find later on.
Okay, so I'm just going to move on. So what we're referring to here in terms of the year 622 is the Ghassanid kingdom. They're off in the west, which essentially is Syria, and the Lakhmid, which is essentially Iraq. There's just a slight difference in terms of the terminology, in terms of the geographical location, but approximately that those two are that. Now, so if we just move on from there, we are going to look at a Chinese source, which I believe is very rarely referred to in any look at Islamic history. So it's probably a good time to bring this one up. It is from 801, so it's quite late, but there's reasons to suggest that this may stem from a much earlier source. Tu, funny name, from an English point of view perhaps, Tu presented his encyclopedic writing, Tung Tien, to the throne. So obviously a very important source. He had begun it in 768, which is approximately around the same time as Ibn Ishaq. So it is late, but as you can see, it's Chinese source, so it's independent. So it can't be accused of being biased. It's well outside of the area. Some parts he took from other sources, so potentially could be much earlier. Please note that Mesopotamia is called Tashkistan by Sebios, as we saw, which might explain why the Chinese refer to the Arabs as Tashi. The term may relate to the Taye or Tai tribe. I'm not entirely certain, but there's certainly a similarity there. On a section in this massive tome on the Arabs, he reveals the following, and I just note that I'm getting this from Robert Hoyland, Seeing Islam as Others See It. So you can look this up yourself if you want to see the full excerpt. Now, the key details that he reveals is the following: that Muhammad was a king, so that's a confirmation. He was a Persian, which is going to be a bit of a bombshell for some of you, and that he belonged to the Tai tribe. So he says, during the Young Hu reign period, 650 to 56 of the great Chang, the Arabs Tashi sent an embassy to the court to present tribute. It is said that their country is West or Persia. Some also say that in the beginning there was a Persian who supposedly had the help of a spirit in obtaining edged weapons with which he killed people, subsequently calling for all the Persians to become his followers. There were 11 Persians who came, and according to their rank as Mushu, which I would suggest is a Chinese attempt to say the word Muslim or the equivalent of Muslim, were transformed into kings. So he's suggesting that it started with this Persian who was the leader, and then there was a series of other Persians who became leaders or kings after that. After this, the masses gradually gave their allegiance, and subsequently Persia was extinguished and Byzantium was crushed, as were also Indian cities. The Arabs were everywhere invincible. Their soldiers numbered 420,000, and by this time their state was 34 years old when the original king had died. His office passed to the first Moshu, and now the king was the third Moshu. The royal surname is Tashi. So this might suggest that if we think back to our guy in northern Iraq that we mentioned, Iyas, we mentioned that he is from the Tai tribe. That would fit with this Chinese source. So I find that interesting. Now, the source that he's using is probably from well before Ibn Ishaq. Certainly wasn't from after the time of Ibn Ishaq, because we can imagine that Ibn Ishaq would have overruled any later traditions. So it's likely that this source that he used and essentially dropped into his encyclopedia was from an earlier period. I would suggest it probably came from sometime in the 7th century. So what we're seeing here from an independent source is a very different story to the Islamic tradition. We are seeing Muhammad as an outsider. We are seeing him as a Persian, particularly, and who belongs to the Tai tribe. And it's interesting, in the Quran, it talks about the person, I can't remember the exact surah and verse, but it talks about someone having a foreign tongue. I don't know, Jay, if you remember that verse. This is someone. This is someone of a foreign tongue. There's an accusation in the Quran. Now, the word for foreign in the Quran is an Aramaic word, ajami, which means foreign, but it also means Persian. So there is an accusation in the Quran. It's peculiar, that says this person has a Persian tongue.
It's actually Surah 16, Ayah 103 that you're referring to. Let me just read it. I've got the Quran here in front of me. And indeed, we know that they, and it's in parentheses, they're talking about the polytheists, the pagans, those who are not believers, say, it is only a human being who teaches him. The tongue of the man they refer to is a foreign, while this is a clear Arabic tongue.
Okay, so a reinterpretation of that is that the word is ajami, which is a Persian word, is an Aramaic word, which means either foreign or Persian. So what the Quran is referring to is someone is teaching the author, but he's not Arabian, he's Persian. So that's, that adds to our case that there is a strong Persian angle to the Quran, which locates it again as here on the borderlines between Iraq and Persia. Okay, so let's move on from there. Another interesting detail is that Ali was governor of Al-Hira in Iraq, just as Iyas was before him. It's a very important city, the capital for the Nestorian Christians. Now, again, Iraq remains central under Al-Hajjaj, its governor from 694 to 715 AD, under Abdul al-Malik and al-Walid. He also ruled the eastern
Can we go back
territories.
to that previous slide on
Yeah,
Ali? You're bringing in then the whole. I mean, you're actually supporting the whole Sunni Shia divide by saying
yeah,
this. Or
yeah,
do you realize that? So you're actually saying now this now makes sense why there is a Sunni Shia divide with the son of Muhammad who Mahmed or whatever the name you or Ilyas, his son lives in Al Hira,
well,
which
no,
is also Iraq.
not
Go ahead.
necessarily his son, but certainly possibly a descendant or a successor of him.
Okay.
So it could be
In the
simply,
traditions, he is the son, but in this case, or the
yeah,
adopted son. But in what you're
yeah,
saying is, in fact, that may be reason why he's the adopted son, not the
yeah,
biological son. In
yeah,
the later traditions, they had to do that
yeah,
for so that they would not give ascendancy to his blood relation. And it
yeah,
looks like this is where the controversy is. If he is governor of Hira in Iraq, as Iyas was before him, then it stands to reason the Sunnis say no, he is not the direct descendants, whereas the Shiites said no, he has to be the direct descendants, and so they've introduced that into the story later on. Fascinating,
yeah,
because you're bringing it up and saying this all now is situated in Persia, not
yeah,
down in the Hijaz.
yeah. Okay. So again, Iraq remains central under Al-Hajjaj, its governor, 694 to 715 AD, under Abdul al-Malik and al-Walid. He also ruled the eastern territories. So you can see Al-Hajjaj is obviously very important, as we'll see in a moment. So if we think about all the significant details in relation to Al-Hajjaj and the origin of Islam. So we have Hajj, which is the Hebrew for festival, and the equivalent of that in Arabic is Hajj. The Jewish festivals of booths, Hajj, Hash Sukkot, or Sukkot even, Hash Sukkot, involved a circumambulation 7 times on the 7th day, which sounds remarkably familiar. The circular is called the Hagag, or in Arabic, or I'll say it fully, Al-Hajjaj. So it's interesting that according to the Hebrew, the person who does the circumambulation is referred to as the Hagag, which in Arabic is the Al-Hajjaj. So that's interesting. We know that Al-Hajjaj is said to have gathered the Quran. He is said to have introduced the use of the Quran in mosques, and Robert Spencer mentions that. He is said to have introduced the diacritical marks as well. The earliest verifiable reference to the Hajj is in the first decade of the 8th century, when Al-Hajjaj was governor. So again and again, we see a lot of corroboration. The circumstantial and artifactual evidence would suggest that he was the one that started this pilgrimage practice. This is a separate issue from the Qibla. We're talking about a specific type of Hajj somewhere off in the west. The location for the Hajj could have been either Jerusalem or Petra. Now, so just as some evidence, this is the earliest Hajj rock inscription. As you can see, it's from 701 to 702 CE. It's right smack in the middle of Al-Hajjaj's reign. The location is 350 kilometers southwest of the current Iraqi border. And as you can see, it's from Ha'il, Arabia. Now, there's also parchment evidence, and it involves a son-in-law of Abdul al-Malik in Egypt, writing to one of his governors in Egypt, saying, essentially, are you coming with me to the Hajj? Doesn't say where exactly. So that's 2 independent sources of evidence, again, that points to the early 8th century in terms of the beginning of the Hajj. But, you know, maybe there's going to be evidence discovered somewhere that might point to it in the 7th century, but as it stands, it looks like it started in the 8th century.
Can I stop you there a minute and go back to the previous slide
Yeah.
again?
Yep.
One before that. Let me make sure that I'm hearing you correct, Mel. You're focusing in on the Hajj, but I'm focusing in on those two other references. You said that he is the one that's responsible for gathering the Quran and then introducing the Quran into mosques and introduces the diacritical marks. Is that what you're saying here? That he is the one
Yes.
that's... Well, if that's
well,
the case...
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just going to say, well, you know, that is also in the tradition. Also in the tradition, apparently, Abu Bakr does the same, and Uthman. But it's possible that the first person to do it may have been Al-Hajjaj, and then it was redacted twice back. Maybe they put it further back in time in order to make it more authoritative and to avoid accusations that it was simply invented during the time of Al-Hajjaj.
So all of these references to Hajjaj is the one who is gathers the Quran, introduces the mosque, put it into the diacritical mark, and also the first verified reference to the Hajj. These are all from the traditions.
The first reference to the Hajj being from the early part of the 8th century is outside the tradition. This is actually the earliest proof that we have of the Hajj.
Okay, so strike off the thing about gathering the Quran, introducing the mosque, and diacritical marks. I would say strike that out. That's not that significant because that's nothing more than, or if you want to say this, what I would say, Mel, in this case is, isn't it interesting that it is actually Al-Hajjaj who actually, even in the traditions, supports the notion that he changes it 11 times. Why would that be important unless, of course, this actually did happen? Maybe he was one that actually introduced it. The traditions then say, no, this happened actually earlier with Abu Bakr and Uthman. And then they have to admit the fact that Al-Hajjaj actually introduces it, because if he's the one that introduces it into mosque, that's hugely significant because that's where are the first mosques that he would introduce it? Well, his mosques. Where does he live? Well, look and see where he lives. He doesn't live in the Hijaz. He lives way up there, and he's well known as being the governor of Kufa. Kufa is just southwest of what is today Baghdad. Again, or as we know as Mehoza, as you're introducing in this talk.
Well, actually, Kufa is the replacement city for Hira. So when Hira got destroyed in mysterious circumstances, I haven't really got to this. It's part of my future research is to find out exactly what happened to the city. But from what I learned, the city somehow got destroyed, and they used the building material from that city to build Kufa next door.
Well, that's hugely significant for the 8th century because it is Kufa that there are. I mean, when we're getting into the Qira'at Qurans, you do know when we get into the Qira'at Qurans that of the 10 readings, the 10 major readings, you have 2 in Mecca, 1 in Damascus, and all the other are in Kufa, which is 7 of the 10 are from Kufa. I'm sorry, 6 of the 10 are from Kufa because there's actually 3 in Mecca and Medina and 1 in Damascus. Hugely important for the 8th century. So it looks like if everything is surrounding the 8th century, even when you look at the earliest Qurans that we do have, I mean, this is for a whole nother video that we can do just on where was the Quran put together. Suddenly now, it's now making sense why the major part of these Qurans are coming out of Kufa. The Hafs Quran comes out of Kufa. And that's why when you look at then the narrators or the transmitters, of the 20 transmitters of them, 12 of them are from Kufa, just from that one city. So the majority of all the Qurans, because you look 12 plus 6, you're getting to 18 of the 30 are from Kufa, just one city, where they should be from Mecca and Medina, at least me from Mecca, Medina, the others from Damascus, but Basra and Kufa, sorry, I shouldn't say just Kufa, Basra and Kufa, but from Iraq, this place that we're talking about today. So that's hugely significant by the time you get into the 8th century. Fascinating, because you're now moving right into what we're the biggest conversation that's happening right now on the internet, and that is the Qira'at problems. So this is, to me, this is exciting because you're bringing up that Al-Hajjaj may be the one that actually introduced this idea of putting together a book, a Quran. And it's fascinating that you're saying that this was probably introduced at this period in 705 or early 8th century by him, which then makes sense of another 30 years later before the first Quran actually comes into existence that we can look at today, and that is the Quran of Ibn Amir.
Yeah.
Fascinating, though. His is from Damascus. The second one would be Ibn Kathir from Mecca, and then the third one would be Asim's from Kufa, and then they all start to proliferate after that.
Yeah, at least according to the tradition. But what I would point out, you know, if we think back to the last video, we spoke about the idea that perhaps they turned material that was in Aramaic into Arabic. In other words, they Arabized it. Now, in order to do that, you have to change it in a location where people had some idea of what they were reading. So it would sort of necessitate doing that work somewhere where Aramaic was still spoken. So we get back to the idea again that, you know, it all fits together very well.
And that, can you then understand why there are, I mean, this is just, I mean, you can just start steamrolling with this, because then you understand then why you have different Qurans that have completely different diacritical marks. That's what the Qira'at are all about. And why you then have 10 different readings and no one complaining about it.
Yeah.
But notice when those 10 were chosen, they weren't chosen until 936, the 10th century. By that time, there would be all kinds of training centers and locations, but almost every one of them are in what is now today Iraq, not down in the Hijaz. Very few of them are from the Hijaz. Yeah. So all the more supporting what you're saying.
Yeah, the Aramaic script as well, when you look at it in terms of its Rasim form, you can actually read it very much as if it were Arabic. So it's very easy to imagine that perhaps, you know, if we were to look at the earliest Qurans in what we think is Arabic, what you could be looking at is Aramaic. And so if that's the case, then you have, when you apply the dots to that text, you could be talking about a completely different meaning, or a significantly different meaning to the original text.
Well, this is what your friend Murad brings up, because he does speak and he reads Aramaic, and so he says this very thing, doesn't he? He refers to this all the time, and he talks about this fact that when you go back to that map again, when you look at that, when you look at see what the Arabic is, and this is what Al-Jalad has been saying. Al-Jalad saying that the Arabic that we see in the Quran, even in the Quran that we have today, it is not Central Arabia. It is actually much further north. In this case, it would be Aramaic. The Tar Marbuta, these kind of things, that they don't exist in the Arabic that would have they've been there in the Hijaz area. Fascinating. I mean, this is for another talk. This is for another video.
Yeah. There's something else I want to point out as well, is that the Nabatean script, which, you know, is key here, it was developed in Hira and then continued in Kufa. Okay, so essentially, when we talk about taking a text which is in Aramaic and then Arabizing it and putting it into an Arabic script and so on, it all makes sense as being connected with Hira and Kufa. So I would suggest that, you know, the story of the Quran having been first written in Mecca, and I can't remember the other location you mentioned, but I think that's another redaction. I think really the work was done in Kufa. But yeah,
it looks like everything has been done in Kufa, and that's one reason why Muslims have not been able to explain why so many of the 20, what we're talking about, 22 of the 30 Qurans that are now the official Qurans, the Qira'at Qurans today, come from Iraq.
Yeah.
Why? If the whole premise was to have them from Quraysh. Okay, back to you.
Okay, so a little bit more on Hira and Kufa. Hira capitulated in 633, and a new city was built nearby called Kufa in 636. Tradition holds that the Arabic script was developed there. The Kufic script ought really to be called the Hira Kufi script, and this is actually a building that was found. I think that is a building from a monastery, so there's not much left of it, but it seems it was destroyed in quite a ferocious manner. I'd love to know more about the manner in which this all happened, but as I say, I don't want to go beyond on what we see. Here's another picture of that area. And a lot of it has emerged as the sand blew off, so luckily it's kind of coming into view now. It was hidden for centuries. And there's another nice piece. As you can see there, it's an image of a church from Hira. And so it's clear that Hira was a Christian city, a Nestorian city. And also another detail, is the cave of Hira, is that story an echo of historical origins in the Lakhmid capital of Hira? So that's another aspect of the story that pops up and kind of makes you think, there's something funny about that. So Kufic is the oldest calligraphic form of the various Arabic scripts. It consists of a modified form of the old Nabatean script. The name of the script derives from Kufa, a city in southern Iraq, which was considered an intellectual center within the early Islamic period. Kufic is defined as a highly angular form of the Arabic alphabet, originally used in early copies of the Quran, and there's Kufa there on the map. I want to show you an image of it there so you can see what it looks like. Hira used the Nabatean Arabic script. After Hira's demise, Kufa took over as an intellectual center. Again, Hira and Kufa were intellectual centers, which again fits in with Pompadita as well. Originally, Kufic did not have what is known as a differentiated consonant, which means, for example, that the letters TB and TH, Ta, Ba, and Tha were not distinguished but by diacritical marks and looked the same, which leaves us with lots of possibilities of misinterpreting the text.
This is fascinating. I mean, what you're bringing up here, this could be an entire study in and of itself, because we've always known that you have the Ma'il script, which is this perpendicular, slightly slanted. Ma'il means slanted in Arabic, to the right, and that you find in the 2165 manuscript that you have in the bibliothèque. I'm sorry, the British Library, there in the Riblack Gallery. You also then have the Kufic scripts, which you're pointing out there, the elongated, much more much more angular, and much more stylistic. And we've always assumed that they coexisted simultaneously. But when you look, and just visually, when you look at the early, well, let's just call it the Ma'il, the early, it looks much cruder, which suggests it is much earlier. When you look at the Kufic, look how stylized that is. It's much more beautiful. It looks like it comes from a place of learning. So what we could be saying, and this is why we're going to have to redo, if the archaeological evidence and the historical evidence suggest that this is all coming out of Kufa, which makes sense now, that's the word Kufic, then you're going to have to understand that this would all have come out during the Abbasid period. The Abbasids were the ones that introduced this script. The Abbasids don't come into power until 749. That doesn't say that you have to have the political power for these manuscripts to start to be produced. But that would also suggest to me that the Kufic comes after the Ma'il. The Ma'il would be the earlier, cruder script, which would be we're going to have to now start putting that onto a timeline. But that's for another time, another date. I love what you're doing here, because you're actually you're not only using the language, you're not only using the audience, but now you're going into the script itself. And that's how you that's how you date manuscripts, by looking at the script. And what you're suggesting to me here is that this is a later script that was introduced in the 8th century, not in the 7th century. It would have not made sense in the 7th century because of the fact, as we've already said, the Arabic was the wrong type of Arabic there in the Hijaz. But in the 8th century, when all these centers of learning, like in places, like you're saying, in Kufa, and these other Jewish places,
Pompadita.
Pompadita and Surah and Nehardia, all surrounding Mehoza, that would make sense that this is where that script then came into its own. This is where that script was introduced, which then suggests to me that we're going to have to redate a lot of our manuscripts. Love it.
Yeah, lots of implications.
A lot of implications, because you're going in lots of different areas here, Mel. You're pulling up an awful lot of material, but it all fits to a piece. And this is what you would expect to happen when you are looking historically. You're trying to stick to the 7th century and you're trying to stick to the 8th century. You've got to see what's in your hands. What are you looking at? And what I'm looking at here is a much later script then, from what you're telling me.
Yep. Okay.
Just one more thing. Go back there just so people don't come back.
Okay.
I mean, if people say, well, yes, but look at the dots are there. Yes, those dots are there. But look, notice they're in a different color, which could suggest they're putting at a later date. When there were diacritical marks, that would suggest, and if you look, you can see where the circles, there's a pyramid of circles there. That is the end of a verse. That obviously is put in a later date because it doesn't accommodate it. So that's
Yeah.
the end of the verse. That is a later rendition as well.
I should point out as well that this is just an example of the Kufic script. It's not necessarily the earliest one that exists. It's just one example. So it could represent a much later one. Okay, so let's look at Hafs that you mentioned a few minutes ago. So there's his name, and at the end of a very long name, which I won't repeat, but you can see he's got Al-Kufi there. It says that he was born in 706 and died 790. Okay, so the 8th century. Born in Baghdad, so again, Iraq. His name suggests a link with Kufa, Al-Kufi. According to tradition, he moved all the way to Mecca in the Hijaz, where he picked up the Kufa recital method from his father-in-law, Asim ibn Abi al-Najud. This name would suggest he came from Najaf, as you can see on the map, which is right next to Kufa. The only way this makes sense is if Kufa is Mecca, because it seems silly if he had a father-in-law that he would go from where he was all the way down to the Hijaz to meet a father-in-law, which you'd imagine his father-in-law probably lived nearby. And, you know, if you just look at it logically, it makes more sense for him to simply go from Baghdad to, say, the Najaf area and learn from his father-in-law there rather than going all the way to the Hijaz. It seems like a redaction is going on. And it's interesting that 95% of Muslims read the Hafs Quran, i.e. a Quranic recitation of an Iraqi student from an Iraqi narrator. In other words, 95% of Muslims read an Iraqi Quran. You know?
just to be fair, that was only chosen in 1924, and it was because the Ottomans loved it. The Ottomans were the one that chose it. I'm just in case people do want to come back on you, but that's the irony. That's one of the ironies, and we brought that up many times. When it was finally chosen in 1985 by King Fahd, why in the world did King Fahd, whoever was giving him his material, why did they not understand that you're choosing an Iraqi script for all the world when you have at least 4 others that you could have chosen that were from the Hijaz that would have actually supported the Qurayshi dialect, proving that they didn't understand that any more than many of the Muslims today.
Yeah, I think one explanation I've heard is that they chose the script that was the simplest for the printers of the time. And
that's
so
exactly why they chose it. You're talking about now, you're talking about the Ottomans.
Ottomans, yeah, the Ottoman period. So that's probably the reason. It's just a coincidence, but it's a coincidence that just reminds us of the Iraqi thesis again. So you can't make too much of it, but if we just look at the fact that
well, you can make up something that it began there and it ends there. You can say that much. Yeah. That's what begins also ends.
Even though they've tried to hide it, it's come back to haunt them. I would put it that way. So in terms of the final thoughts, then the Iraqi thesis helps join the dots on a lot of holes in the Islamic narrative that never made sense, such as why the caliphs didn't rule from Mecca, but instead way up north in Hira, Ali supposedly, and Damascus. It recognizes there were some qiblas that point towards Petra, but prior to the 690s, the religious buildings were not Islamic mosques, but precursor, such as Abraham's places of worship directed towards Petra, maybe because it was the burial site of Harun. And what is most important is where we could likely find an audience competent enough to get the obscure allusions to Syriac and Talmudic stories. Mahoza, Old Medina, verifiably fits that requirement. So essentially, if we look at the abundance of evidence, and this is a small part of an even greater amount of evidence, I think it's fair to say that there are massive holes in the Islamic tradition, and there seems to be an effort to hide what really went on in the early days. Now, so I'm just gonna unshare there.
Well, while he's bringing it back to the two of us, let's just wrap this all up and bring it into a conclusion. I've taken notes as you've been going along, like I usually do. I want to just, from a person who's hearing it from the outside, this is what I picked up from what you've said. Jump in at any time to correct me like you did in the earlier video. I think that's good that you do that. But this is what I'm hearing you say, Mel. And I think this is important that you are saying what you do, because you're actually saying not only is the language, as we said in the earlier video, not only is the language from the Iraqi area, the audience is from the Iraqi area. And this is where you're pointing to. Look at the audience. And when you look at the audience, you can see that there are these cities of the Jewish cities of Pumbedita, Surah, Nehardia. Look and see, then you have Hira, which is the Christian Nestorian city. These 4 cities are all places of learning. And much of the words, as we said in the earlier episode, the words, 70% of the words, the foreign words that are in the Quran are from Aramaic, sorry, not Aramaic. And the center of the Aramaic language is this part of Iraq, exactly where this is going on. But it's fascinating because you have the Jews have their center of learning. Therefore, the whole area, that's where their center of learning is there in Pumbedita. Fascinating, because that's just around what is today Baghdad, very close to what is today Baghdad. Earlier was Ctesiphon and Mahoza. And then you say that you look at Surah 112. And you notice that Surah 112 is very clear. That's the same surah that is introduced on the Dome of the Rock. Why is that such a significant surah? Because it's attacking those they're having a discussion with. And it looks like the discussions they're having are with the Jews and the Christians. If that is the case, then it stands to reason that they're attacking the person of Jesus Christ, his begottenness, and also his divinity, which is in chapter 112. You talk about Medina, the city of Medina, which is main city, you're right. But then you look at Medina al-Atiqa, which means the old city. The old Medina, the old city, which is the Persian name, which is fascinating because that suggests that maybe that's the Medina that the later traditions are getting confused with. And the whole exile going, as we know, the hijrah means the exodus from one place to another. The exodus has always been in the traditions, the later traditions is always from Mecca to Medina. It looks like what you're saying is it's not from Mecca as in Saudi Arabia, it could from Al-Hira to Medina. Al-Hira, which would be the previous, because that is where the center of power was. That was the center of theology for the Nestorian Christians. And now they're moving away from the Christians, attacking the Christians, and moving back now to Medina, the old Medina, where is now the central part of where the Muslims are now coming into their own.
I do want to bring something. I do want to bring something in. Actually, it was something I forgot to mention, and it's actually very significant. There are a number of other words in Mandaic which are very significant that I want to tell people about. Isa is it's a Mandaic spelling of the word. It's how it's pronounced in Mandaic Aramaic. It's Isho in other forms of Aramaic. It's uniquely how it's pronounced and spelt in Mandaic Aramaic. So that's significant. Yahya, or Yahya, I forgot to say it right the first one. Yahya is also the Mandaic form of John, Johann. So those are significant words there. So
now, just remind people,
that's
Mandaic
extra support.
Mandaic is what part?
Yeah, so Mandaic is actually from the Persian side.
So it's
just it's the eastern part. It's literally over the river in the Tigris area. So it's not far. In fact, it's inside the border where Mahoza is, which is Old Medina. So we find that's like the intersection between two dialects. So you have the Babylonian dialect meeting the Mandaic dialect. And so you can see why it's using a bit of both there. So, you know, it's interesting that the only place that we can find the word Isa in terms of a dialect is Mandaic. So it's much easier to suppose that the Quran was written there than way down the Hijaz that doesn't have this explanation for the particular spelling of it.
Fascinating.
So I thought I'd end with that bombshell. I think it's significant, you know.
Wow, that is a bombshell. I mean, I'm going to have to now change my lectures if this is the case, because we've been asking, where does Isa come from? Because the word in the Arabic today is Yeshua, which is like Yeshua from Hebrew. Why is it Issa's in the Quran? If that is the case, if it's Mandaic Aramaic, then that places it right there, right around Mendoza again, right around the old Medina, right around Ctesiphon, right around Baghdad, right in the middle of Iraq. Brilliant. Thanks, you. Another bombshell, as we're going to be seeing. So the exile goes back to that. Also, the year of the Arabs, and that's just what's just fascinating. You're looking at the year that today we call it after Hijrah, but this is actually pointing to when the Ghassanids and the Lakhmids come together and push out the Persians and the Byzantines. That's why that year is always a big one, because when did that happen? 622, as we saw in an earlier episode that we have. They push them out and they throw off the yoke from that. That's why from there on out, that becomes the year of the Arab identity. They now have their identity. They now no longer are colonized, and they're throwing out the oppressors. Fascinating, you brought in this whole thing from China. I love that. So you're not just looking at what's happening there on the ground. You're saying even as far away as China, back in the 8th century, yes, it's in the 8th century, but
actually,
it would not.
Well, 9th century, beginning of the 9th century. Yeah, just to be.
Sorry, I thought it was 768.
Oh yeah, from 768 to, well, if I'm being to say the final date would be 801. It finished in 801, so yeah, okay.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, 1 year into the 9th century. But more than likely this is written in the 8th century. Whatever it is,
mostly,
from 760 up to 801. This is a Chinese, and again, it's so far away, no one would have had it. It is completely and I love what you said. It is not dependent. No one could have had control over this writing from that far, thousands of miles away. So here is an independent, completely independent source that's referring to these people as Persians, and that they are the Moshu, which you think are maybe is their way of calling these people Muslims. That's their derivation. Is that what you're saying? I'm assuming.
Yeah. I don't know exactly what word they were hearing in terms of Persian. I suppose that the linguists listening will probably provide some evidence on that.
Well, as we desecrate the Arabic today, and as you tried to do so in your reading, so they would have desecrated it even more, because that is symptomatic. Whenever someone tries to take a word they hear, they put it into how they hear it in their own language. But you're interesting, because they do talk about Muhammad as a king, as a Persian, and from the place of Ta'i, which could be a derivation of the Tajikistan, which is Mesopotamia again. Again, placing him in. So even the Chinese place him in the right place, get him up there.
And they say he was, and they say it happened west of Persia as well, very significantly. Not south of Persia, not southwest of Persia, not south.
That's right. So it's nowhere south of Persia. This is west of Persia. You talk about Ali, that he could have been the descendant or in some way related to Muhammad, but they're both from Al-Hira. Iyas is who you're referring to. And then you go into Al-Hajjaj, and you say that Al-Hajjaj, who is the governor of Kufa, so what we've been told under the ruling of Abdul Malik, but he was way over Kufa. Look at where Kufa is. Kufa is Iraq. And look at the significance of this man, Al-Hajjaj. He is the one that starts the pilgrimage. Well, pilgrimage to where? Well, then that's where you're going to have to get into some of Dan Gibson's material, because he does say that he has these Wasat mosques, the in-between mosque. And if you take a look and you see now, Dan Gibson and you are going to have a discussion as to how you interpret these different qiblas. But go ahead.
I do want to say something about that, just even though it's quite brief. So if you think about the three groups, the Jewish group, the Christian group, well, let's say, no, actually, we'll focus on the Abrahamist group, which are the main writers, I would suggest, of the Quran, the Abrahamist group. You have the Christian group, and then you have the Mandaic group, which we might refer to as the Sabians. So the Nestorians, being Christians, prayed to the east. That would be their Qibla, essentially. You have these Abrahamists would have prayed to the west. And then you have the Sabians, they prayed to the south. So in terms of the tussle, where they're praying towards suggests who's in charge. Now, it's interesting, once the Abbasids take power, where you find the Mandaic group who pray to the south, suddenly Mecca gets moved way down south. So I'm just suggesting that this may be a possible explanation for why they moved things way down south to fit with the Mandaic point of view, which is they were used to praying south. They're the ones who prayed 5 times a day. And there's lots of other similarities between them and the later Islam. So I'll just throw that in.
Throw that in. I think this is something. I'm going to put a big question mark on this, because I do like what Dan has done. Dan Gibson has done with this. And he looked for me right now, his view of why you have a Mecca from Petra moved down to the present day Mecca. If you look at all the 5 stages of the Hajj, that you do see there, they can all be they are all reproduced in Petra. But that's for
Yeah.
another time. That's for another debate. Again,
Yeah.
this is a white paper. We're putting it out there, and we're saying both are possibilities. That this will continue, and we may need to have both you and Dan on board to actually talk to each other and just put your theories back and forth and let the general audience come to their conclusions. But that's what we're doing, isn't it? You all come to your conclusions. Are you now seeing what Mel has done here? And this is, I hope you're picking this up. Mel is supporting both linguistically from the Arabic itself, moving from the Aramaic to the Arabic. He's also looking at it from as far as the physical evidence that's on the ground. He's looking at it from the historical view of where the big centers of learning are coming from. He's even using references that are words that are also definitions of words that come that could only be Persian or could only be Iraqi. And then he's also even using evidences that come as far away as China to support the fact that all of this material, these people are not from the Hijaz. They're from much further north, and they're from much further east. And they are all from the area of Iraq, which should not surprise us, as Mel said, because everything we've known about the great civilizations is from that area of the world. This is the seat, this is the cradle of all the great civilizations. If that is the case, then why are we surprised that not only the Jews are centered there, so are the Sabaeans, so are the Mandaics, so are the Christians, Nestorians especially. They're all centered in that area. And that's where the dialogue is going on. And with that debate going on between them, it stands to reason why the Quran keeps on talking about the fact that they always refers to the Jews and the Christians. And then it also says, why is it that this book is an Arabic book? Why is it an Arabic book? Because there's a discussion going on as to whether or not it is an Arabic book and whether there are other languages that are influencing it. Great stuff, Mel. I mean, this is starting to get our juices going. It's getting our not only our brain cells functioning again, but I'm sure there's going to be a huge discussion about this. We want you to discuss. Put your ideas out there. If you don't like what Mel has been saying, say so. If you do like what Mel's been saying, say so. But come back and peer review us so that we can then get together, and we'll probably do it next week, Mel. You and I will get together and we'll actually answer some of these questions. But we need you to put them out there. Send us out to other people, because we're revising the whole history of Islam in one fell swoop. And we're saying we're sick and tired of all the traditions that are from the 9th and 10th century that are kept on imposing and only giving us one narrative. And that's the only narrative that has been taught in all our schools and all our seminaries and all of our seats of education here in the West and also around the Muslim world. We're sick and tired of it because they're the wrong people, the wrong place, much, much too late and at the wrong time. And we also, as historians, have asked, where then is the evidence on the ground? What Mel has done in these series of videos, this is the third one we put up this week. These series of videos, what Mel has done is what every historian should be doing. Why they haven't done it to now, I don't know. But he's going back to the time period when this all took place. He's going back to the 7th century. We're only interested in the 7th century. He's gone back to the languages. He's gone back to the names. He's gone back to the cities. He's gone back to the centers of training, all from the 7th century. He's gone back to quotation after quotation, even looking at artifacts, even looking at the script of the Arabic. And he's saying in every case, they all point to one place. And that place is where, surprise of surprise, is where it should be. It should be Iraq. So you started out with Iraq. Looks like we end with Iraq. It looks like, as you're going to say in later time, it is where civilization began, is it not? If that's where the Garden of Eden began, it's in Iraq. If it's where the civilization began, then why are we surprised it's also where Islam began? But how did it begin and why did it begin? It began because of these discussions that were going on in the Abrahamic fold, these discussions that were happening between the Jews and the Christians and these Arabs or these Persians who then wanted to have ascendancy. So can you see why this is important at this time, now in the 21st century? We're starting to connect the dots. And what Mel has done a great favor. Thanks a lot, Mel. God bless you for all the work you do. God bless you for your humility. And God bless you for the fact that you really are striking a nerve here. Keep it up. We want to hear more. And as you can see from the many comments, people are excited. We're going off the records as far as the number of people who are hitting this and are watching it and are also responding to it. So over to you, Mel. You have the last word.
Well, thank you, Jay, for having me on again. As I say, this is a thesis, or, I've gathered up evidence from different sources, and this is how I interpret it, and others may question it, and they may say, well, I disagree with this point or that point, but I challenge people to refute me. Tell me if you think I'm right or if I'm wrong, and tell me why. Tell me why we should trust the Islamic tradition and why we shouldn't trust the historical evidence. So I'd like to hear from you.
I was fascinating. I got a email from Robert Spencer last week, and then he said, "Jay, could you please call me?" So I called him up, and he said, Robert Spencer says, "I'm going to have to rewrite my book. I'm going to have to rewrite Did Muhammad Exist?" And my editors agree with me. So he is now in the process of rewriting Did Muhammad Exist from 2012. He's going to have 10 years later a completely
Really?
new book. And he's going to introduce some of your material, and he's going to put that
Wow.
and says, we've got to redirect, we've got to re-understand, we've got to start going back to the 7th century and look at it anew.
Wow.
So you're getting a lot of people on board with you, Mel.
Well, that's amazing.
They're not necessarily agreeing with you. I'm not saying they're all agreeing with you.
No.
Okay.
No.
But at least
That's
what
good.
they're saying is you're bringing into this whole discussion a whole new category that we've not thought of before. And I think from years to come, people are going to look back and say, Mel, you opened up a real maelstrom. You opened up maybe Pandora's box, but what a box. And this is terrific because it's getting us back to the truth.
What I would like to say to the Muslims who are watching is I don't want you to just accept what I'm saying. I want you to think, because you've been told one story. Don't trust me. Go and look up the sources. Go and look at the evidence that I've suggested. Work it out for yourself. Think for yourself. Don't trust the people around you. Trust your own instincts. Trust your own eyes, your own ears. Look at the evidence for yourself. You may come to a different conclusion. That's fine. But at least think and see what happens, because it's more important to find the truth than to live your life according to a myth or a legend. It's more important to find the truth. And actually, it doesn't matter how it turns out, because at the end of the day, at least you know you've found what is true and not something that's false. That's important.
Mel, thank you so much. We're going to call you, and we're going to say you're the Iraqi man. We're going to call Gibson the Jordanian man. So the Jordan against Iraq. Which is it? Where did Islam begin? Jordan, Iraq. What's noticeable, it did not begin in Mecca. So God bless you. It's been good to have you on board. We'll see more of you. Back to you again. And this is Jay, then, and Mel. Over and out.